I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands I'm on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any Indigenous people who are joining us for today's discussion. I'm Troy Henderson, the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab, which is a collaboration between the University of Sydney, Macquarie University and the ANU. And the lab is interested in how basic income can help us better understand and address issues such as financial security, how it might help reduce people's exposure to different species of risk, and also how basic income challenges us to rethink our notions of what are valid and valuable contributions to society. And I think the focal point for our discussions today, the Liveable Income Guarantee, provides a great sort of entry point for exploring those types of issues. So we obviously have been through, or some would say we're still going through, this COVID-19 pandemic thing, which still seems to be hanging around. And as part of that, we saw a centre-right coalition government in Australia essentially double the unemployment payment for a period of time and relax conditionality for a period of time to create a type of quasi-basic income, a sort of a natural experiment with basic income for a period, using as part of its huge fiscal stimulus to combat the pandemic. However, we know that the snapback phenomenon was real, and very quickly we have reverted to a situation where Australia has the second least generous cash transfer payments for unemployed persons in the OECD, and also among the most punitive and conditional. And we moved from the situation of pandemic to snapback into the last federal election, where I think most people would agree social security, particularly social assistance payments through the transfer system, didn't feature prominently during the election campaign. But there was this very interesting policy released by the Australian Greens for a livable income guarantee. And we felt here at the lab that it was really worth some more detailed consideration. And very fortunately for us, today we're joined by three fantastic speakers to do just that. Senator Janet Rice, Australian Greens Senator and spokesperson for social services. Professor John Quiggin, a very well-known and accomplished economist from the University of Queensland, and to the best of my knowledge, one of the co-originators of the Liveable Income Guarantee concept in Australia. And Professor Gaby Ramia, who is Professor of Policy and Society here at the University of Sydney and a leading authority on social policy and the welfare state. Each of our speakers will give a 10-minute talk before we open things up to the audience for questions. And I think we may be joined during that period by an additional special guest. Yes, I can see him there. Scott Santons, who is possibly the leading advocate of universal basic income in the US context, and someone who has been analysing the policy and advocating for it for a long period of time. I think since at least I met him in 2014 and probably before then, and has actually been living with a basic income floor through Patreon since 2016. Scott's visiting Australia to speak at the Basic Income Earth Network Congress in Brisbane next Monday through Wednesday. And he will also be speaking at an in-person event at Barangaroo this Friday after work. If anyone's interested, there are a bunch of links being posted in the chat as we speak. He has just got off the plane from the States, so if he falls asleep during this seminar, cut him some slack. Okay, let us get cracking with this session. And first, I'd like to ask Senator Rice to provide an overview of the Liveable Income Guarantee proposal that the Greens took to the last federal election, including the aims and motivations for the policy. Senator Rice, over to you.
Thanks, Troy, and thanks to the Basic Income Lab for bringing this together. I'm really delighted to be here, and I feel very privileged. I'm amongst the company of people who are much more expert in this than I am as a mere senator. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining here today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge we've still got so much more work to be done to be reaching justice for our First Nations peoples, and sort of committing ourselves, hopefully everyone in the audience as well, to be working for truth-telling, working for justice and working for treaties with our First Nations people. And in the context of a livable income guarantee and income support, I've been really thinking about this a lot as we going back to Parliament next week, repealing the cashless debit card, which hopefully will happen next week in Parliament, which is such a harsh punitive condition that has had a really disproportionate effect on First Nations peoples. So look, I'm going to be mostly talking about the details of our Livable Income Guarantee initiative and the costing that we took to the last election. But I wanted to start with a story that just encapsulates just one example of why a Livable Income Guarantee is so needed. And this was a story I shared with the Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. And Nicholas is 24, and tragically, just before the COVID lockdowns, he was diagnosed with a brain tumour. But despite that, he wasn't eligible for the disability support pension because he might have got better. So he was denied access to the DSP and was forced to rely on JobSeeker. And every 3 months, despite the fact he's got a brain tumour and can't work, he's got to get new paperwork to show that he's unable to work. I mean, the system is broken and it's really harming people's lives. So a livable income guarantee is really important. It's a real alternative. As Troy has already outlined, during the COVID pandemic, we had a brief period where the rate of job seeker was lifted above the poverty line, and a real evidence that the poverty that people face today is a choice. It's a political choice that's being made by successive Liberal and Labor governments to maintain a system that is punitive and inadequate and really harmful to people. For us as Greens, the principles that are guiding us when we're facing political choices, they are determined by our members. We're a grassroots party, and we're a party that's got set out in our principles that we believe that a socially just, democratic and sustainable society, it rests on the provision of an unconditional livable income complemented by the provision of universal social services. And we want to see the eradication of poverty in Australia. Yep, it might seem to be impossible, but that's what we're aiming for. And so the approach that we took to the election was informed by that. So our approach was to first to develop and then cost a set of systematic fundamental changes to the system that would ensure that a guaranteed livable income was available to anyone in the country who needed it. And what our system does, rather than, we know that there's a lot of debate about what basic income or a livable income could look like, we decided a pretty straightforward way of approaching it was to raise the rate of all of our income support payments to $88 a day for a whole range of payments, whether it's JobSeeker, the DSP, youth allowance, student allowance, the age pension, and a number of other payments. The rate of $88 a day was quite deliberate. It's what the Henderson poverty line was set at in May. I mean, obviously we recognise there are different measures of poverty, and we use the Henderson poverty line in our costing, but we think that it should be something that's revisited by government, setting a national definition of poverty in collaboration with academic experts and the community. So that's what we decided to lift the rate of all payments, but raising the rate of payments isn't enough on its own, because we knew that we also needed to address the harsh punitive conditionality that stops people who need support from getting it. And so our policy was to abolish all mutual obligations. All of us have heard story after story of people being harassed and bullied by employment services providers. I mean, there are good people who are working to provide support, but far too many providers are in it for profit, not for people. And our costing included abolishing those mutual obligations so that employment services would still be there for people who want them, where they're genuinely useful, but that punitive conditionality would be gone. We also took to the election of abolishing compulsory income management. It doesn't work. And we have so much evidence, from academic studies to the ANAO reports to the accounts of people themselves. It's harsh and it's unfair, and it's really a punitive measure that when we should be providing support services. And if you need any evidence of that, just recently in the last month, look at the evidence that's been presented to the inquiry into the bill that, as I said, we're discussing in Canberra next week, to abolish the cashless debit card. And a final point that we need to talk about, and which was included in our platform, was ensuring that government agencies are well resourced. And so our costing included a policy for an extra 5,000 full-time staff to Centrelink, so that wherever you are in Australia, whether it's Western Sydney or Tasmania or a remote community in the Northern Territory, you can interact with somebody who's able to support you. So we know that a policy like this is something that can be done, but it's a choice. And we know because, yes, the Liberal government did it during the pandemic. They briefly lifted payment rates above the poverty line. And I really want to acknowledge the excellent work that was done by many researchers that I know who are joining us today, particularly the work of Elise Klein. And what a difference their analysis of what this change made shows. I mean, one of those studies by Elise and colleagues found that people use that increase in the COVID, in doubling of their income support to meet basic needs, that removing mutual obligations and providing the supplement meant that people's physical and their mental health improved, and that people turned away from day-to-day survival towards envisioning and working towards a more economically secure future for themselves and their dependents. And with the mutual obligations gone and the supplement in place, despite the fact that we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, where the economy was tanking because people were having such difficulty actually continuing on with working, their research showed that people increased their engagement in labour market and other economic activities, which runs directly counter to the mantra run by some economists that we must punish and force people to engage in the labour market. I mean, the simple truth is that we must and we should pay above the poverty line because it's a human right. But additionally, the data shows that people who want to find work are able to do it better when they're not constantly at risk of homelessness and thinking about where the next meal is going to come from. I want to share another person's story that I spoke about in Parliament last week, the last sitting week. This person, let's call them Alex, was a student, and they couldn't find a part-time job that fitted in with their study hours, so they were attempting to survive on student allowance. And they told me that despite dumpster diving for food and living in cramped shared accommodation, income support was so low that I often couldn't afford the bus to class, which severely affected my ability to study. And due to my poor standard of living, I got really sick and could not afford the diagnostic tests my GP recommended, as there were out-of-pocket expenses that were not covered by Medicare. So Alex just put up with their illness, which didn't improve, and they were regularly unwell during their studies and they were struggling to complete them. Then along came COVID and the doubling of income support, and they could afford to see the specialists. So Alex's illness was diagnosed, they had surgery, and they got better. And they finished their studies and are now in full-time employment. And their final words to me that they asked me to share with the Parliament, which I'm sharing with you today, are, "My heart breaks for people still trapped in poverty while the cost of everything skyrockets around us. Please do something." So where to from here? I mean, obviously the Labor Party haven't committed to a guaranteed livable income, so there's more that we're going to be doing. We're going to be pushing them further and faster with every bit of legislation. And in particular, we're going to be fighting so that the $244 billion in the stage 3 tax cuts that are going to the very wealthy, to billionaires, to people earning above $200,000 a year can instead be spent on the income support that people need. Just in the last sitting fortnight, we established an inquiry into the extent and nature of poverty in Australia, 50 years after the Henderson Poverty Inquiry was established. And we want to hear from policy analysts about the change that are needed. And critically, we also want to hear the lived experience of people living in poverty currently, surviving on poverty rates below the poverty line. And we want the inquiry to enable their voices to be heard by MPs in the Parliament so that people can share their stories of what being forced to rely on inadequate payment has done to them. And most importantly, we are going to keep fighting to raise the rate of income to support, for push for higher rates above the poverty line so that people have got enough to survive. Thank you. I really look forward to hearing the rest of our seminar this afternoon.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Rice. Very much appreciate your contribution and your time today. I just want to remind people that you can post any questions you have for the panelists related to the topic as we go, and we'll come back to them once we've heard from all of our speakers. And also I think I forgot to say that the event is being recorded and will be available later on the Australian Basic Income Lab website. Okay, we're now going to move on to Professor John Quiggin, who, as I mentioned earlier, is really someone who's been thinking about this concept of livable income guarantee for at least a couple of years through the pandemic period. So it'll be very interesting to hear from John how your ideas have evolved in this area and what points of overlap and points of difference there might be between your livable income guarantee ideas and the Greens policy. And now in true economist style, John has a few slides, so I'll hand over to John and let him share his screen.
Thanks, Troy. I'll just try to share screen. I always do this with trepidation, but I think it should work. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. As Troy's indicated, the phrase livable income guarantee was something which was put forward by a group of us, including Elise Klein, who's in the audience, and Tim Dunlop, coming out of a bunch of discussions with Greens and others. And we have a version of this, somewhat different, as we'll see from the Greens, but essentially along similar lines. So I suppose just echoing what Senator Rice has to say, one of the striking things that has this air of paradox is to help people give them money. Now that seems obvious, but it's inconsistent with a bunch of widely held beliefs. The phrases like throwing money at problems seem to suggest it doesn't work. Arguably, the biggest finding in welfare economics of the 21st century is, well, mostly it does work. The biggest problem poor people have is they don't have enough money. And this is applicable both in rich and poor countries. So
sorry to interrupt, John, just to
yes.
quickly point out that we can't see your full slide now.
Oh, dear me. Yes, okay, I'll try. Yes.
No,
how's that?
Yes, that's fine.
Sorry, no, I just my face will get funny. Yes, so Duflo and Banerjee, who got the Nobel Prize in economics recently, development economics, have done a lot of work on what's the most effective way of helping people in poor countries, and mostly it is giving them money. That's not everything is qualified, but that really is the answer. That rather than trying to carefully plan how best people should use the money we might give them and give them the resources we think they need, the best thing to do is to give them the money and let them work out what their biggest needs are, because they're going to differ very much from person to person. But Australian public policy in the 21st century has been going very much in the opposite direction, hopefully with some recent reversal. So policy that's really driven, as far as can be determined, by focus groups rather than analysis. If something like work for the dole sounds good in a focus group, it becomes a policy. Been on the whole a bipartisan move, again until very recently. Lots of conditionality, compliance and constraints embodied in things like cashless debit cards and so forth, but more generally the whole rhetoric of mutual obligation, which in its first incarnation back in the 1980s was the obligations on one part were to be available for work, and on the government's part to make sure that work would in fact be available. That was turned into an obligation to perform various sorts of work at below market rates, most of which detracted from any chance of actually securing a job. So the experience of the pandemic, I'll skip over this since Senator Rice has already covered it, really showed that we could do things differently if we chose. And it's also important to compare this, particularly globally, to the global financial crisis. But even in Australia, we've had a much bigger and stronger recovery because we managed a bipartisan support for a large-scale expansion rather than what we saw in the GFC, which was that the Rudd government gave us a stimulus, but was then pushed very much to wind it back by the opposition. So briefly, what a distinction that's crucial here is how we're going to approach this. The common basic income approach has been give money to everybody in the community, up to and including Gina Reinhardt, and then try and claw it back through the tax system. The alternative, which both this proposal, the 2020 proposal we put forward, and the Greens, is to work with the existing system, ensure that people who don't have an adequate income get one, and to expand this through the provision of benefits which are income tested. And so importantly, this works on a household rather than an individual basis, as our welfare system does. So the 2020 version, a bunch of us looked at this. Key points were to restore the parity of unemployment benefits with the age pension, which was ended in the early 1990s. At the time, it seemed like a temporary shift, but in fact, unemployment benefits were then frozen for 30 years, while the age pension rose in line with community incomes. A compliance approach, which is similar to taxation, that is auditable self-report, so that we start from the presumption, the opposite of robo-debt, that people are doing the right thing. If we find we're doing the wrong thing, failing to comply with the conditions of the benefits they're receiving, they can be sanctioned. So there is a requirement to contribute, but we don't start from the assumption that anybody who is in receipt of a benefit is cheating, and expanding the eligibility of benefits to cover a wide range of contributions to society, as well as looking for work. Full-time study, volunteering, artistic and creative work are examples that we had in mind. So Green's proposal, Senator Rice has already covered it. The difference between the 2020 version, a higher benefit, the $88 a day is the poverty line for a single person in the workforce. So that's the highest one. Most people's poverty line is below $88 a day. For example, there are a couple not in the workforce and so forth. So our proposal had a lower benefit by being modelled on the age pension. On the other hand, the Greens proposal is confined to existing categories and raised the question of, well, what about people who aren't, even on a generous interpretation, eligible under the existing categories? So we did. I've been doing with my former honours student Peter Limerick a bunch of modelling of how different proposals and different designs work. We have a micro simulation model called Capita that has a representative body of, I think, about 10,000 households, and so we have information on their income and circumstances. We can model the impact of the policy that of any policy we like within limits. And what we did in this was to compare the outcomes of the Greens proposal with the existing policy, including the stage 3 tax cuts. So this is what we haven't done is to do a one-for-one comparison with the 2020 version of the Liveable Income Guarantee. So first point, and contrary to the costing by the Parliamentary Budget Office seemed to us to be over-optimistic. I'm not possibly because it didn't take account of the amount of additional take-up that we modelled in our story. So we came to the conclusion that the policy wouldn't pay for itself. It would require a significant but not unmanageable increase in tax revenue. Throughout our analysis, we focus on the effective marginal rate of taxation, which is the combination of clawback rates from benefits and marginal rates of income tax. Important feature that people aren't aware is that's mostly lowest at the very top of the income distribution, where people are only paying marginal rate of income tax of 47%. Most households who are in the benefit system in any way are paying a higher effective marginal rate of tax than that. I'll, in the interest of time, just skip down and observe that the bottom line, line 8, this policy would reduce the number of households below the Henderson poverty line essentially in half. That still leaves a bunch of households who don't fit into the existing welfare system who wouldn't benefit, but we achieve a very big reduction in poverty. And we now can look at these graphs which show the impact on households. And so this, I think, is important as an analytical tool. What we have is this, the dotted line here is people whose position would be unchanged under the policy. Those below the line end up worse off, and that's essentially most, after you get to about 50,000 a year, most households will be paying more tax, but you have a huge numbers of benefits below here, particularly for lone persons who do pretty poorly under the existing system. And I think both the examples Senator Rice gave are of single persons. They don't have access to a bunch of benefits that households, particularly with children, have. And so my time was just up. So I'm hoping that I haven't, that we're staying on track. So our crucial summary, I guess, is it's radical in the context of current policy debate, but entirely within the realm of economic feasibility. The Greens proposal will cut poverty rates in half at a cost which is fiscally manageable. So I'll leave it there and turn over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, John, for an excellent presentation, and you stuck exactly to time. And in the interest of continuing to do that, we'll move on to our third and final speaker, to Gaby Ramia from the University of Sydney, who we've asked to address the merits of the Liveable Income Guarantee from his own perspective, I suppose a broader perspective in relation to the critical problems and pressing needs of Australia's current welfare system. So Gaby, over to you.
Thanks very much, Troy, and really great to be in this terrific company. I'll hopefully be really quite brief in my remarks, perhaps a bit briefer than the other speakers. Perhaps also a warning that I might use some more classical and outdated terminology, but I'm only using it really because I'd argue that it's just as needed now, and in fact more so than when it was first used in writings that I've been reading for a very long time. So I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that I'm on Gadigal land, the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects sincerely to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also take this opportunity to acknowledge any First Nations people in our audience today. So look, I've left the explanation and the justification of the detail in the Liveable Income Guarantee model to Janet and John. I'd like to use my allotted time, first of all, to explain why I support the spirit of such a program. For me, it's less in the detail, it's more in the principles that kind of sit behind it. It's more in the social values that are represented in social policies that kind of are more of interest, I think, in and perhaps more of what I can contribute. So a livable income guarantee for me represents social values and policy concepts, social policy concepts in particular, that we should embrace. It's worth supporting, at least in spirit, if not in concept, the idea of an irreducible minimum standard of life, a universal minimum wherein nobody needs to fall behind, a contemporary approximation of what the Fabian socialists Beatrice and Sidney Webb in the late 19th and early 20th centuries called a national minimum. We should, I think, support the concept of what in social policy has long been called decommodification, which sits underneath the Liveable Income Guarantee concept. As Josta Esping Anderson made clear in 1990 in his very, very still influential model of the three worlds of welfare capitalism, and I quote, "Decommodification occurs when a service is rendered as a matter of right and when a person can maintain a livelihood without reliance on the market." That, by definition, is what we mean by decommodification. By extension, different policies, different policy models and different policy frameworks, different policy settings in different institutional frameworks within countries, different countries have different potential to decommodify. Policy design really counts. The other way to think about this is that perhaps now more than ever and in our lifetimes, for reasons that are familiar, I think, to most of us, or at least should be, we need to find ways that policy can support a minimum standard of life, regardless of whether whoever can perform paid work or not. That is, even if they're required to care for others without monetary payment specifically for that work. In doing this, we do better, I think, at integrating the worlds of work on the one hand and welfare on the other. We blur the lines a little bit between the two because we need to, because it's not possible for everyone in our economy to do paid work. And I don't think we should do as much as our policy systems have done in recent decades to compel them to do so. In doing this, in thinking in this way, we make the lines between unpaid work, paid employment, the receipt of welfare payments from the government less distinct. We allow more effectively for self-determination. And if you like, one way of viewing it is that we foster individuality more than we foster individualism. The former is a concept that aids community. The latter is a concept that aids market participation. And that's something we've never really done in Australia. It's never really been part of our policy history. Let's think then about the question of other ways we could achieve the kind of integration I'm talking about between work and welfare. So one way is through a comprehensive, and I think John laid this out, a comprehensive, planned, formal, universal basic income model. My view is that the Liveable Income Guarantee moves us closer to that, but it's not the same, for reasons that I think, again, John outlined, and Janet also. Another way we can achieve this kind of integration is through what welfare regime scholars, after Esping Anderson, again, have called the social democratic world of welfare. We've seen versions of that, mainly in operation in the Scandinavian countries, though, to be fair, in recent decades, that model has been somewhat downgraded. On the back of the work of Francis Castles in our own context, in the Australian context, but others also who have followed him since the publication in 1985 of his very famous book outlining the wage earners welfare state, Australia was thought historically to have achieved something of that integration between work and welfare, where minimum wages, and this is the specific Australian and partly New Zealand model, historically, minimum wages were thought to cater for a notional average family. And Social Security merely picked up the pieces for those who simply could not work. But major problems and shortfalls lay in the exclusion of women and the exclusion of other disadvantaged categories of worker. And of course, if one could not work, there was no requirement for the system to offer benefit adequacy. The question of living standards wasn't really part of the design, never has been. The system ran and still runs on targeting, and it was always and remains residual for the most part. We do have some exceptions to that in modern times, but for the most part, our social security system is residual. So there was and there is no income guarantee, and there's not the prospect of one, at least in post-2020 Australia. I'll talk about 2020 in just a moment. A livable income guarantee provides, pardon me, a workable means to achieve some notion of universality, minimum standards below which nobody can fall, and some means to integrate work and welfare. It would also have the benefit of not stifling economic productivity. And this is the mistake often made in mainstream discussion. In fact, arguably, it can result in a higher and more even standard, in a more even standard of living across a country's population should basically see improved economic outcomes. We've seen this repeatedly in history. In recent history, for example, we saw it partly in the response of the Rudd government to the 2008 financial crisis, which saved us from recession. And again, more comprehensively, of course, in the policy response to the pandemic in 2020. That when we offer irreducible minimum standards and measures which decommodify, we increase aggregate expenditure and not lower it. Let's restate the obvious and be clear about this. The economy benefits most when we give money to those who have less money. Why? Because the poorer the person, the more likely they'll spend the extra income that's given to them. In Keynesian economic terms, lower income earners have what they call a higher marginal propensity to consume. We can serve social and economic goals through the same policy instruments. We have the means at our disposal. In the policy response to the pandemic in 2020, we saw, contrary to the beliefs and the horizons of many, that there are in fact very few institutional and policy mechanisms or or arrangements that stop governments from increasing incomes almost unilaterally. In 2020, the most conservative government in our lifetimes gave us the closest approximation, as Troy said at the very outset, of an irreducible nationwide income guarantee as much as we've ever seen. A coronavirus supplement on existing social security benefits, a doubling of unemployment benefits, a wage subsidy in the form of JobKeeper. Nobody was left behind, at least no permanent residents. We even, as Janet mentioned, totally relaxed mutual obligations for those who were subject to it. We've, of course, reintroduced it, and we've gone back to the arrangements more or less that were there before 2020. But we saw the results in 2020 in the research of ACOS, the Greens and others, academics as well, which included the fact that homeless people were housed and people who were always struggling were suddenly able to put more food on their tables. We know who was left out. It was the temporary visa holders, whether they be tourists who could have been stuck in Australia. In fact, international students were more prominent among those. But nevertheless, they were told more or less, and in almost those words, go home to the country where you're from. And we saw the results of that. That's research that I've been involved with others as well. But in doing all of that during the pandemic, what was done, the government introduced a temporary policy regime which combined work and welfare, decommodified at least permanent residents, and that was achieved in the space of weeks. Little political fanfare, and without the customary reservations of Australians who deserve to benefit, who deserves to benefit more or less from taxpayers' dollars. In short, for a moment in history, we quashed the stigma of welfare, which so many have written and spoken about over the decades. We can do similar things again. This is one proposal where we can approximate that kind of setting. What we need, though, is the political will and the parliamentary will, if that's not an over-exaggeration. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for that. Another excellent contribution, Gabby. Thanks to all three speakers. I'd like to throw it open now to questions. So do keep your questions coming through. I see John's been very diligent in answering numerous questions through the talk. So there are a couple there which I'll go to. And I'll start with one for Senator Rice, and then I might go to Scott, introduce Scott to the discussion, both with a direct question I think we have from the audience and any general reflections that he might have based on the US and broader experience. Okay, so Senator Rice, one thing about the Liveable Income Guarantee is to acknowledge that all contributions people do, not just paid labour. This moves towards a broader definition of work than paid labour, inclusive of people who do unpaid work. But now the government, the ALP, seems to be doubling down on work is paid labour through their push towards full employment. How do we get the government to be more open to work as being much broader than just paid labour? And can they do this given they are the Labor Party? Okay, over to you, Senator Rice.
I think it's a really good question. And in terms of the discussions we've had with the Labor Party, because they are the Labor Party and with the big backing of unions, actually their focus has always been, well, we just have good conditions and get people into work. So I think one obvious way is it is really just laying out the reality of people's lives, and that not everybody, there's the issue of whether everybody wants to work and the value of the care economy. And in fact, we've got an inquiry led by my colleague, Barb Pocock, that has just been launched as well into work and care, which is going to be exploring this very stuff. And so there's that issue. But then even for people who want to work and, the need for flexibility. And so not everybody can work the full 38, 40 hours a week, and that people have got, other commitments, people have got, differing abilities to be able to do that work. So I actually think just, prizing all of this open and saying, look, the model of everybody being able to work, full time and to be earning that, that good wage is just not one that's realistic for so many members of our society. And to just continue down the path of thinking that that's where everyone's going to be headed is just sheer, it's fantasy. and actually, acknowledging that. And so then it's working out, well, if that's not the case, well, then how do we ensure that everybody has got that minimum standard of living, given that they're not going to be able to participate full time in the workforce?
Thank you very much, Senator. Okay, I'm going to go to Scott now, and I will preface this direct question that we have from Darren, which I think is a sort of conceptual question, with this sort of just the fact that Scott's been involved in the basic income movement in the US for around a decade, and been influential in things like Andrew Yang's campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination, in the very interesting Mayors for Guaranteed Income movement that is sweeping around the US, and has done a lot of analysis and commentary on some of the US COVID intervention policies, such as the child tax credit. So has that sort of perspective on different ways of maybe progressing or not progressing the basic income debate forward. So you might want to talk to any of those, Scott. But the specific question we have from Darren is one he's probably heard before. I know Scott Sandens thinks that a UBI, that without a UBI, that modern monetary theory job guarantee has a BS jobs problem, the old David Graeber idea. Does he think that these livable income guarantee proposals also have that problem, I presume? Scott, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Troy. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll start out by just saying that, when it comes to the BS job stuff, just so everyone's clear who's listening to, this is how some people can be doing jobs that they themselves feel are unnecessary, that aren't actually really adding productively to the economy, but people are doing them because they need income. So David Graeber's hypothesis in his book, the solution was to fully decouple income from employment with an unconditional basic income. And so, as long as there is any kind of, participatory mandate, some kind of minimum income, some kind of job seeking requirement, like something along those lines, that means that people aren't fully unconditionally able to refuse the labor market, then you're not going to have a labor market that is fully, drained of this unnecessary employment. Like, you really need to make sure that people have the freedom, the power to say no, and to determine for themselves what valuable work they want to be doing, paid or unpaid. And then also, of course, it's up to the employers then to make sure that wages are high enough, that jobs are actually meaningful enough, that the conditions are good, to actually entice and encourage people into the labor market to do those jobs. So I think when it comes to UBI versus anything, something needs to be fully unconditional in order to handle the BS jobs problem. Just from the American context separately, I'll add that there are certainly some very interesting steps toward basic income that I would argue that we did in the U.S. And mainly, I would say the stimulus checks and our monthly enhanced child tax credit that lasted for 6 months. The stimulus checks, I think, were really important because that they didn't have any kind of minimal income earnings requirement, that even though it used previous tax forms, which was a problem, but at least if you hadn't filed taxes, then you could actually apply via a special portal that the IRS set up. And so even if you had earned nothing, you could still claim your stimulus check. And so therefore, the only means testing on the stimulus check was at the upper end. So we were just trying to exclude people who had earned too much to receive an income. And of course, along those lines too, I was even arguing against that, saying that, this is a great opportunity to show that we shouldn't even be means testing at the top. Instead of saying that if someone's earning $100,000 and they had earned $100,000 in 2019 prior to the pandemic, and there is nothing that we could say for certain that their income hadn't fallen to zero in 2020. And so to exclude them based on old records was just, you were going to leave people out. And why not just tax them actually after the fact to make sure that, you look at what people ended up earning in 2020, the next year in 2021, and then calculate, backwards instead of trying to calculate forwards during this emergency. So that was interesting on that end. And also I would say that it was important because even though we had boosted our unemployment system as well, we did a flat rate boost to all unemployment, which was a big deal. We also expanded it to gig workers and freelancers who had usually been left out of the system. It was really important for these stimulus checks to reach people that had lost income but hadn't lost their jobs. And so it was 1/3 of the labor force in the US saw a decrease in their incomes in 2020, and yet they hadn't lost their jobs. So the stimulus checks found them. The unemployment boost did not find them. So I think that was a great example of how a basic income program could actually reach everybody in a time of great emergency, and in a way of not trying to calculate who needed what in this time of great emergency. And I would argue too, as before, that we really should have just looked at the taxes after the fact and calculated then. And then when it comes to child tax credit, again, very interesting. That was 6 months of those checks. On average, it was around $430 per household with families. And that told us a lot. Like, it was really interesting how, we didn't see any decreases in employment. We actually saw an increase in unemployment when the check stopped, when the final check went out. So then come January, parental employment actually dropped. And we also saw big reductions in desperation, which I think is just very poignant to point out, that parents actually needed to sell less of their blood plasma as a result of these checks. And they also actually started using abusing alcohol and drugs at a less of a rate because of these checks as well. So really showing that desperation went down was a big deal. And, entrepreneurship went up as well. And, all these things, people think, oh, they're gonna not work, they're gonna use drugs. And we didn't see that. So hopefully these kinds of things help. And hopefully the fact that people were actually receiving these checks and saw this was a big deal. And we do see that politically, that is the case. Hopefully we will see, hopefully this can be more of a salient issue as our midterms approach in November, because there's polling that shows that there are certain key demographic voters in the US who, more than anything, even more than abortion, and even more than gun control, really want those checks back. They were extremely popular, not only among parents even too. So I think that a lot of these things that we saw are important in showing the argument and getting people to see what it even feels like on their own. And hopefully that can make a difference. And on the negative end, I would also say that it really sucks that inflation is as it is around the world, because people are now just, blaming stimulus checks and any kind of benefits that governments provided to their people, saying, oh, it's just too much money in the system now, instead of the fact that there's a pandemic and Putin invaded Ukraine and supply chains and all these other things going on that are actually really at the the main issue here. So on the downside, that's the other part of it.
Thanks a lot for that, Scott. I think you're coping with the jet lag very well. I might just quickly go to Gabby. We've got a quick question here from Tony saying, what do you mean by decommodification whereby service is rendered as a matter of right? What is meant by service in this context?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it should be taken literally. It doesn't necessarily mean just services, whether that be employment services, health services, education, whatever. But it's decommodification is really just a term that says you should be able to live your life to a decent minimum standard, to some extent at least, without necessarily having to participate in a market. It's a kind of it's living as of right, which is part of the definition. It's a form of what they call citizenship, which is based upon social rights as well as economic rights and legal and political rights. But it's a broader idea of being able to live better without necessarily having to sell your services on the marketplace, and typically that means work. But it could in our contemporary context also refer to whether or not, for example, if you're an unemployed person, whether you need necessarily to take part in services, to take part in mutual obligation and similar programs where you have to contribute, if you like, to the market requirements and objectives of an organisation that is there based upon a commercial contract with government.
Thanks a lot for that, Gabby. I'm going to take a slightly different approach with the time remaining. We have about 20 minutes, and just put 3 questions, or the core of what my interpretation of 3 questions, to the panel in general, and anyone can feel free to jump in relation to these questions. And I think one we have from Eve Vincent, which is really about the political narrative. So this difficulty we have in the Australian context of basically not going through with huge tax cuts, the stage 3 tax cuts that several people have talked about, the difficulty in implementing things like a super profit tax that we saw last time that the Labor Party was in government. So do we need to find some other way to make the argument, I think, around the revenue needed for this type of program? So that's one question I'd like for you all to consider. The next one was about, inequality underpins lower productivity. To the extent that UBI addresses inequality, it might look like a positive policy in the shorter term, but in the longer term, as the redistribution failure is addressed, how do you argue productivity could keep up with demand? Okay, so sort of an economic question about the interaction of UBI, productivity and inequality in the medium term. I might throw that one to John, actually. And then we have a question which is, I think, about the politics of basic income. Now, Scott is one person who argues pithily that, basic income, it's not left or right, it's forward. But many others would argue that, basic income is some type of utopian left-wing policy, and it's really the province of political progressives or more radical people. So how do you appeal to a different type of constituent to say that this policy of a livable income guarantee, for example, might be in their interests? So those are the 3 questions. Would anyone like to take an initial stab maybe at any of the political narrative one from Eve Vincent? Janet, Senator Rice?
Yes, call me Janet, that's fine. I'm happy to basically tackle the first and the third in terms of the politics of it. And essentially, there's no doubt that if you're going to have a livable income guarantee, it is going to mean an increase in government expenditure, at least in the first, in the short term. There will be a lot of other expenditures over time that would be decreased in terms of, health outcomes, education outcomes, all sorts of things. But, our costing from the Parliamentary Budget Office said that it would cost around about, I think it was $41 billion in the first year, going up to $51 billion a year in the 10th year, with something like 90, a bit on 100 billion over the forward estimates. So essentially, if you are going to not be running, increasingly large budget deficits, which I don't, some people might argue that that's a possibility. From our perspective, that wasn't what we're arguing, and we said that the cost of having that livable income guarantee should be covered. And there are a range of ways that we put forward as to how you would increase taxes on the very wealthy, on the billionaires, to cover that cost. And the stage 3 tax cuts were the classic case in point, which we have continued to argue that you look at the cost to the budget bottom line of $244 billion over the 10 years and think, well, this is the other thing that this could be spent on. And I think they resonate with the general public because people realise that they are not going to be getting much benefit from those stage 3 tax cuts. That the benefits are going to go to people earning over $200,000 a year. Politicians, for example, I'm going to get a $9,000 a year tax cut. I do not need a $9,000 a year tax cut. People like, Gina Reinhardt and Harvey, or every billionaire in the country will benefit from those stage 3 tax cuts. But in addition to that, then there are other taxes. We've put forward a corporate super profits tax, a mining tax, a tycoon tax, and then ending corporate handouts to fossil fuel companies. So rather than paying out $60 billion a year in subsidies and handouts to fossil fuel companies, why don't we put that money into our income support and other services? I think this actually resonates quite well with the Australian public, but it is not reflected in the Labor Party's policies any more than it is in the Liberal Party's policies. And that's because of the vested interests of the people who are actually influencing what their policies are. And it's to do with the revolving door of the people that are involved in both major parties who are then working for these large corporations that are doing very well out of the current system. And it's about the donations that those companies make to the Labor Party as well as the Liberal Party. And it's about the power of the right-wing media. We know that if there was a proposal from Labor to be increasing taxes in any way, shape or form, that they're going to get a pile on by the Murdoch media. And so actually, the issues that you need to tackle are how do you tackle those vested interests? Tackling their power, tackling and reducing the donations to political parties, having transparency, having a federal ICAC, for example, reducing the power of the right-wing media. These are all a sort of mix of things that need to be tackled in order to get actually what mainstream Australia would be pretty happy with to be implemented as government policy. And so for our role as Greens, we will just be we'll be in there, we will be hammering this, on and on and on and on. We have more influence now in this current parliament, obviously. Any legislation that the Labor Party want to get through the Senate, they've either got to negotiate with us or with the Liberals. There will be things that they absolutely will decide they'd prefer to get the support of the Liberals to get through. But it gives us a lot more power and a platform. And, essentially the media now are paying much more attention to what we're saying than what they have in the previous 8 years that I've been in the parliament. And so we will keep on pushing this and changing the narrative and really emphasising and telling the stories of the people who are doing really badly out of the current system, the people who are living in poverty for absolutely no fault of their own, but it's just because we have got this incredibly harsh, punitive system that is destroying people and is bad for the country overall. And we will keep on talking about that and do our best to be changing that narrative and to be building political support for ideas like a livable income guarantee.
Thank you very much, Senator Rice. I'm going to go to John now. And John, feel free to respond to any of those questions that we went through. But I also wanted to ask you very directly, as one of Australia's most distinguished economists and also political observers, can Australia, the Australian polity and Australian economy, as it's currently constituted, introduce a policy that would mean increasing annual taxation receipts by $30-40 billion a year?
Okay, so I'll start by saying, I think the stage 2 tax cuts are very much up for grabs. Labor said all the same things that Janet did about them, how bad they were, then decided they still had to promise them, and we certainly have seen some ultra-left defeatists saying they're in there, but it's notable that Dr. Chalmers, the lead push on this, was saying we need more revenue. That was in the middle, I guess, of the royal mourning period, and seemed to slide by without much notice. But given that there were plenty of small businesses eager to complain about an extra day off, the fact that he could say it and not be picked up, I think, is striking. So I think there's plenty of room to fight that battle, and I think the government, now they're actually in, is starting to realise how difficult it will be to cut spending in the way they imagine. We've already seen, for example, pandemic stuff that was supposed to be phased out being extended, seeing that the amount of easy cuts that can be made to the previous government's programs is not nearly as large as it suits to appeal. Every opposition says we're going to eliminate fraud, duplication, and waste, but by the time there isn't much there. So then the question is, can we get away from essentially the ratio of tax to GDP that was fixed by the Hawke government back in the 1980s? I think the room is there to do it, partly simply from the pressure of we have a lot of programs that are going to be very difficult to cut. Can we get beyond that to something like a Liveable Income Guarantee? I think it's possible, but I don't think it's going to be easy. And I think that what we need to do, coming to more general political strategy, is broaden the notion of what contributes to useful contribution to society. We've seen a lot of that happen, I think, with respect, for example, to carers, that's been recognised, and in important respects with respect to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, that people need support if they are going to make such a contribution. You mentioned left-wing utopianism. I guess I'm in favour of utopianism. I mean, I think what the left has been in this defensive crouch for a very long time. If we're putting up proposals that won't make it in this parliament or the next parliament or the parliament after that, that's still what's needed to change the conversation. So the politics aren't easy, but an obvious. I mean, to briefly comment, if Labor is going to shift and position itself for the long haul, there's no better time than to do it. I mean, the opposition is an utterly hopeless mess. They seem incapable of picking up anything and running with any effect. So there's that short-term option. But I think the long-term is simply we keep on pushing these ideas forward, drawing on the experience of the pandemic, which I think has undermined one of the key props of this stuff, which is, look, we've always done things this way. We can't do things any differently. Although not much of the pandemic policy has survived, the idea that, yes, actually things can be very different, I think is something that has lasted and I think is going to continue for a long time to come.
Thanks so much, John. We'll go to Gabby now and then to Scott. Gabby, what's your read on some of these political and cultural challenges to something like basic income or a livable income guarantee?
Yeah, thanks. They're real concerns, there's no question. I think what's often underestimated is the role of, well, a couple of things, let's say. One is political leadership, and the other one, I think, is the sense that we have the policy levers at our disposal, the policy accommodations, if you like. So first of all, in terms of political leadership, have you noticed, for example, that since the election of the Albanese government, we've talked a lot less about asylum seekers? And that's really no accident. It's because the government has made a real effort, I think, to depoliticize an issue. And that's good political leadership. I don't agree with everything they've done, but in a sense, we have politicians and governments of the day have more power than I think we often estimate ourselves to allow political issues and political footballs, if you like, to rise and fall in the consciousness of the public. That's one thing. So I agree, of course, that when it came to the pandemic, the fact that there was an emergency, a crisis situation, the fact that also the Morrison government was a particularly conservative government, allowed them, in fact, to get away with things that perhaps Labor would have had more political kickback about. But the question of leadership, I think, stays. The second thing is that I agree with the others on the question of tax, on policy accommodations. We do need a greater tax take. If you look at the Australian, where Australia ranks in the OECD in terms of actual tax take, effective tax, we are far closer to the bottom of the OECD than we are to the top in terms of actual tax taken. So we've got a lot of room to move if we do that in a way that the government uses, more sensible means to conduct political debate about it. I think that's possible. The other thing I would say in relation to, to kind of bring it back to some of the issues that are at the core here, I really think we need to think about how damaging mutual obligations really is. I'm not the only one who's said it's not actually helpful for people getting jobs. It's been said. The other thing that I think is really needed, though, is a sense in which we used to have a notion of labour market programs as being for training people for jobs that are suitable for their skills. Even the economics of labour market, even labour market economics would tell us better to train people for the skills that are appropriate for them given their educational and other background. So I think we can do a lot more in relation to that, of actual labour market programs that are suitable for unemployed people. And I think also we could be talking about retraining and rethinking the system of labour market programs. Perhaps that's not as high on the agenda as other things, but that's something I've always believed we really need since we got rid of the Commonwealth Employment Services way back, or Commonwealth Employment Service way back.
Thank you very much, Gabby. And I'll turn to Scott now, and feel free to respond to any of those points, Scott. But I think one of those questions that I particularly wanted to put to you, because I think you've had experience doing it, is how do you talk to Conservatives about UBI?
Yeah, so there's a couple things when it comes to Conservatives that I think are important. First of all, I always like pointing out that when you look at the world as far as like basic income programs in existence, really the best thing to point to is Alaska, which has had their annual dividend since 1982, fully universal. And of course, this is a conservative state. They don't see it as any kind of welfare program or anything to stigmatize. This is their rightful share of Alaska's natural oil wealth. And I think that kind of dividend framing, which is also part of the reason why Yang used it, that dividend framing, it reaches Conservatives better. And then the other part of this too, also from Yang's usage, is freedom framing. And so there's been some polling along these lines to test out various framings and what works. And it's interesting how, regardless of the framing, it pretty much hits those on the left the same. Whereas you definitely can get more support from a freedom framing of basic income, and then you would not gain that support from other framings of basic income, like let's say focused on poverty, this kind of thing. So framing it around this freedom of freedom from domination, freedom from employers who would abuse you. It's not only about freedom from government, but freedom from private businesses too, that people can get behind. This, freedom is just a very popular kind of concept. Another part of this is marginal tax rates. I think when you push this, understanding that, hey, does it make sense to means test something in a way via clawback, where you provide someone a benefit on the condition that they stay unemployed, on the condition that they keep their income below a certain level, then as you pull it away, you create this high marginal tax rate. So if you can get Conservatives to see that the existing system, because of that way of going about it, introduces marginal tax rates, around 80%, 90%, even over 100%, then you're actually disincentivizing labor market participation. And they can wrap their heads around that, and they understand that even from a conceptual level. So then when you frame basic income as something that lowers marginal tax rates in a way that removes this disincentive, then you can get conservatives behind that as well. And I guess what also mention, I just want to mention to the productivity question as well. I just want to say that I personally think that basic income is really important to increase in productivity for multiple reasons. People have this assumption that basic income will reduce productivity because they think that people are lazy. And if you give people money independent of work, then they won't work as much or at all. But study after study shows that that's not the case, that you don't reduce participation in the labor market, that even where you do decrease it, like with students and new mothers, that you actually pull more people who were out of the labor market back into the labor market. And so you just don't see that decrease in employment. And at the same time, you see this increase in spending thanks to more people having more money to be more customers. This operates along the marginal propensity to consume that increases the stimulus to the economy, which creates jobs, which enables more people to do more stuff. This is actually something that's really important to the economy and also extremely important to entrepreneurs, which are, small businesses are the driver of the economies. And so, if you're able to get more capital people and these entrepreneurs are able to have more customers, then that's great for productivity. And also you see what we're seeing right now, where you can have greater bargaining power from employees, and people will complain, oh, where are all the workers and stuff? And yet at the same time, what they're saying is, where are all the people willing to work cheap? Basic income increases bargaining power, which means wages go up, which means that people are actually more interested in the jobs that they're doing because they're actually doing it at the wage that they're agreeing to. And also that increases automation and the incentive for employers to invest in automation, which I think is exactly what we need to be doing to increase productivity. Part of the problem is that people are working for too cheap because they can. If you can get anything, then you're going to accept anything. Whereas basic income actually allows you to withhold until the deal is agreeable to you. And there's the BS jobs argument too, where if you drain out those jobs, you're going to increase productivity that way as well. And also, you should be able to free people to do unpaid work. They're going to be much more interested and much more productive doing something that they really want to do versus something that they feel that they have to do. So for all those reasons, I think that there's actually a very good pro-productivity argument for basic income, and not something to be worried that it'll somehow hurt productivity over time.